So, welcome to our lecture on stress, anxiety, and arousal. My first rhetorical question of the lecture, and there will be many, is why do we lump these three unique concepts together? When we measure them, when we observe them or research them, it appears as if we are able to distinguish them, but in this lecture, I hope you find a more contemporary approach to stress, anxiety, and arousal. This has always been the definition of stress, that the demands being placed upon you are greater than your ability to cope or your resources. There are a few parts of that definition which are key. First of all, it is a perception. You may well have been wrong in your appraisal and actually you can cope just fine, or that the demands being placed upon you are not that bad. So if we look at stress like a cycle, we move through 4 stages. After being subjected to the environmental demand and perceiving it as something you can or can't deal with, the 3rd stage is how the body responds, and finally, the observable thing, how we behave. We are often much better at identifying the behavior than understanding the environmental demand. As a coach, I'd also like you to reflect on how often we train for successful events like event importance or uncertainty. If you perceive that the stimulus is too big or you can't cope, then that's trouble, and that simulates the stress response. Some people have added to the definition that you must believe there are serious consequences for you if you fail. So it's too much for me to do on my own. I can't cope with that, and if I fail, I'm in trouble. In some definitions, if you don't have that believed consequence at the end, then it's not considered to be real stress. This quote is from classic literature when people were just starting to get a handle on what this phenomena even is and how to begin conceptualizing it. At the other end of the spectrum, entirely from this stress response, is arousal. Arousal is very basic. Stress involves this perception and evaluation on your part at a cognitive level. I believe this is a big demand. I evaluate that I can't cope with that. There's a lot of thinking going on in that situation. In contrast, arousal is believed to be very physiological. If I wanted to increase my arousal, I could run up a flight of stairs and back down again, and my heart would be pumping faster, so I'm apparently more aroused. You can track that. You can see how cortisol or adrenaline are released in the body, anticipating or following physical exertion like that. We fudged around with the definition of arousal historically, sometimes mixing it in with anxiety and other times not, or only measuring the extremes of experience like high to low, very to under aroused, and that misses out on some important aspects of what arousal is. There's an image coming up shortly, but if you imagine one axis where one end is very cognitive and the other is very physical and physiological, then arousal has to be at the bottom of that spectrum. Very physical, short-lived, very little cognitive involvement, and if you can define it that way, then it'll make your life much easier to remember that distinction. In theory, arousal can vary from deep sleep to frenetic or a frenzy. If we stick with the cognitive to physical spectrum, then anxiety fits neatly in the middle, but it has its own subsections. Anxiety states are characterized by subjective, consciously perceived feelings of apprehension and tension, accompanied by or associated with activation of the autonomic nervous system. And we can just about tease out the physical and emotional elements. Notably, it's something you're conscious of. When it comes to small or moderate differences in arousal, somewhere between waking up and being alert, to maybe almost falling asleep on the couch at night, you don't really bother to notice the difference. It's not really on your mind. Whereas anxiety finds its way into your awareness more often than not. In fact, the way we measure it, by mainly using questionnaires, means it has to be on your mind, otherwise you wouldn't be able to pick a response. So, should they be considered as the same thing? You will see them used synonymously when you read about them, and of course in sports commentary or in social media. Later in this lecture, we'll look at the connection between them and whether it is something organic or something we have forced together as a result of our theories and how we decided to measure them. To keep ourselves sane, it's helpful to have this clear distinction between the two concepts and understand which one we may be referring to. So, arousal is a general physiological and psychological activation varying in intensity along a continuum, whereas anxiety is a negative emotional state with feelings of worry, nervousness, and apprehension associated with activation of the body. So this is not from a textbook and shouldn't be referenced, but it's a conceptual drawing regarding where these concepts sit in the body. At one end, we have arousal, which is largely physiological, and the other, stress, which it requires a cognitive appraisal that may or may not be accurate and lasts a long time. One of the best measures of stress we have, which you'll see next, measures over the last year. In that conceptualization, stress is believed to last a long time. When it comes to straight and state-based anxiety, again, they are sometimes mistakenly used interchangeably when it can be difficult to distinguish them. You can think of trait anxiety as an element of someone's personality. The difference between a super chill and laid back person and someone like me who hits the roof when a car backfires. Given they form a part of who we are and influence our behaviors, it is considered to last longer than state anxiety, which, as the name suggests, can occur in a fleeting moment or particular mood. If you've seen the textbook example, or I'm sure you have your own experiences that you could likely draw on, these stages can fluctuate over time, even within one event like a sports match. And it's often tied to a physiological response like palms sweating, heart racing, or feeling tension. Being critical, which is something you are highly encouraged to do, differentiating between state anxiety and arousal can sometimes be difficult. In some definitions, the arousal response is preempted almost by an awareness of anxiety, and that awareness alone makes it difficult from a purely physiological response. Think about how we measure something like arousal, like how well the skin conducts electricity. These things you can't control consciously, but you are quite aware of the other sensations, like your heart racing. Now, keep in mind, psychologists love a good questionnaire. So now we'll dive a little deeper into state and trait anxiety. We like to say, well, if we can understand someone's general tendency to get anxious and make predictions of that. So someone has a personality that tends to get anxious, then we say that's trait anxiety, and whatever happens, they're just very prone to becoming anxious. That's great because with questionnaires, we can correlate things and make sweeping statements like anxious people tend to perform worse, or anxious people tend to get injured more often, or whatever it might be. If we can measure it as a personality or stable trait, then it's very convenient to do that. We know from personality literature that some people can change substantially between situations, so it may not be that helpful to look at their personality. Maybe it's more helpful to look at the here and now, like how do you feel, and then look into how likely they are to perform or get injured, etc. One of the biggest problems about this approach is just by asking them, you ruin it. If you're about to do something very important or requires a lot of expertise and someone says, hey, are you nervous? Then you ruined it because they're now conscious of what they were doing and how they're feeling, and that actually interferes with the way that they move. So I love this quote. It's at the start of the chapter of the textbook, and it says, some people think football is a matter of life and death. I don't take that attitude. I can assure them it's much more serious than that. And I think that's a great way to sum up how much this means to people, and the way it can affect us. So measurement-wise, given the continuum runs from very physical to very cognitive, maybe even cortical adrenaline. So those are some of the ways that we would measure arousal. In terms of state anxiety, well, you're a little more aware of it, so a questionnaire might work. Trait anxiety, again, we gotta love a good questionnaire. And stress uses questionnaires as well. There seems to be a recurring theme here, doesn't it? Questionnaires, especially on things that you feel or are supposed to be aware of, are often self-reported. There's research to suggest that athletes are actually quite good at identifying their state anxiety levels within an hour of the game, according to Hannon and Syria. But it's self-reporting a reliable way to capture this information? I'll leave that question with you. Plus, when it comes to measuring stress, would you really be able to accurately remember life events over a year? People forget stuff, especially if those things are traumatic or stressful, and they don't want to have to keep thinking about it. In a scale like this, the more points you score by experiencing these events, the more likely you are to become ill or have an accident, because annoyingly, stress can limit your peripheral vision and narrow your field of vision. It's a better way of measuring stress because it's long-term and considers appraisal, so it's a better representation of what we're trying to measure. This scale is believed to be an excellent predictor of people becoming ill or getting injured, which is exactly what stress can lead to, so maybe it's doing quite a good job. This is a model or versions of a model that outlines how we can think about arousal, or in particular, we can think about it as affect, which is very similar in that it's measured at a physiological level. We're talking about something very similar between arousal and affect. If that is a fair comparison, then we end up with a model that goes two ways. The y-axis, so up to down, relates to activation as high, low, and the x-axis, left to right, as an unpleasant, which is the appraisal we make whether it is something we like or not. As you can see, there are many ways to conceptualize these four quadrants. We can look at high activation and unpleasant as activated unpleasant. Distress, high negative effect, or even tension. Notably, tension is a physiological response, so the bottom left and bottom right circles are often viewed together. If you've deemed your high activation as a positive or pleasant thing, then the categories change to energetic, excitement, positive, etc. Because it's simple, if you pick one circle and just use that one, you can get people to point at how they're feeling. One person isn't a very good representation, but if you get multiple people to track how they're feeling, then patterns emerge. There are numerous questionnaires in psychology, especially considering anxiety, and one of the favorites is the State Trait Anxiety Inventory, or Competitive State Anxiety Inventory-2, found in the textbook on page 79. These theories listed here are often attached to some of the questionnaires, but when a theory tells you exactly what to measure and how, then that should raise alarm bells. You should ask, what's missing, or what am I being told not to measure with this theory? This is one from the history books. We're going right back to the start, and no doubt you've seen this model at some point before. I even remember studying it in about year 9 physical education. Confidence and motivation also appear in very similar ways. In the beginning, it was simply believed that more arousal equals better performance, forgetting that some sports like darts or snooker or brain surgery or other high performance actions don't require you to be that aroused. The name drive was attributed because if you're more aroused, then you appear more driven or you have the drive to do something. In work as recent as 2020, I found that people who seemed to lack dedication or drive were seen as the people who find their ways out of talent programs and sport. Really obviously, that falls apart because we know that there is such thing as too much arousal or anxiety and goes against you. This model didn't last very long. Again, the inverted U hypothesis works on the Goldilocks effect, which believes that there is a just right between the too little and too much. But it doesn't break down into stress, the two types of anxiety, or arousal. It just clumps them back together again. Even though it's specific in that this relates to physiological arousal, this tells us very little about how unique personalities or anxiety levels may alter this mode, let alone the variety of tasks within sports or different sports altogether. It might serve as an easy theory to grasp for a pub conversation, but it doesn't provide coaches or athletes with any useful information. To its credit, it's intuitive. You can probably identify times you felt flat or under-aroused or even psyched and over-aroused. And if you're really lucky, you can even highlight when you found that perfect middle ground. This makes the inverted U hypothesis very popular with people on the internet and high school teachers. To solve the problem of not matching the demands of each sport, unique tasks, or even individual athletes, Hannon suggested that individual zones of optimal functioning exist. He used bandwidths to categorize the levels that are too low, too high, and just right, and it depended on the person and the sport. It was just a way of personalizing and specializing the inverted U hypothesis in a meaningful way. It was a creative attempt, but there were still problems like smudging together stress, arousal, and anxiety. It also doesn't say why there's a difference. It just describes the shape of the curve for that person. So here's what the bands actually look like, each athlete potentially being from a different sport. But there's little rhyme or reason behind this attempt to conceptualize arousal and or anxiety. Again, probably a familiar sight if you did senior PE, but it's easy to understand and somewhat personalizes the model. At the end of the day, it's just a creative adjustment at best. Now we reach the stage in the 60s and 70s where they tried to separate the types of anxiety for the first time. We started to recognize that cognitive state anxiety, like worrying, and somatic state anxiety, like physiological arousal, influence performers in unique ways. The relationship to performance was also differentiated by saying cognitive has a powerful negative influence, while somatic had a weaker influence altogether. The idea was that cognitive anxiety is generally bad for you. The more you have in your mind thinking negatively, the worse that it is for you. A straight negative line. Somatic state anxiety or physiological arousal still acts in an inverted U, like the previous theories, where increases in anxiety can facilitate performance up to a certain point before it becomes detrimental. An easy notion to follow by now. But what if they interact? What if one influences the other? Well, that goes beyond the math that psychologists like to do, which is limited to correlational analysis, so we prefer to look at them separately. By separating them, it allowed us to identify different predictors or antecedents to any changes in anxiety. Temporal patterning showed us how each type built up, where cognitive increased slowly in the lead up to an event and somatic peaks like just before a game. It suggests that they're right to be separated, but we still don't understand how they interact. It also suggests that they can have different relationships with performance. which is exactly what this graph illustrates. Even though we have evidence that each type of anxiety does influence performance in different ways, as a theory, the multidimensional anxiety theory doesn't have the same support because of its first and fundamental prediction. More anxiety equals worse performance. But we're missing something. What about perception? We've already said that we perceive whether we are capable of dealing with the threat, but this theory only looks at the type or amount. Even the textbook gives a scathing review, calling it of little use in guiding practice. So by now, you've probably started to consider some of these limitations, I hope, if your critical thinking hats have stayed on. If it is only descriptive and you cannot falsify it or test it, then it's not really a scientific theory. Plus, I find it very difficult to follow any suggestion that something happens always. Life, sport, individuals are far too complex to know what always happens. Finally, if cognitive anxiety is always bad, why do we have it? Why do we do it? There must be a situation that exists where we evolve this propensity to act. Something has gone wrong, switch on the brain. That makes sense. There are some situations in life where you do what feels right without thinking about it. Then it goes wrong and you've got this massive brain which is devoted to thinking hard thoughts and analyzing things. That's why we're here. In contrast, this is usually the worst response you can have in sport or high performance environments because more cognitive load is actually associated with amateur behavior and performance. Moving on to catastrophe theory, and a little more recently in terms of history, we still cannot shake that inverted U hypothesis. This time, physiological arousal relates to performance only when an athlete has low cognitive state anxiety, so that rules me out. The implications of high cognitive anxiety are far more detrimental and sudden in this model, where going beyond the point of optimal arousal results in a rapid decline in performance, or the catastrophe. Here, the interaction between cognitive anxiety and physiological arousal remains intact, but the key difference is that recovery is believed to take longer when surpassing that optimal arousal zone, which you may have experienced or believe sounds pretty logical. This is why it gained good initial support, but does it really take us beyond the inverted U hypothesis? Under this theory, the effects of somatic anxiety or physiological arousal is essentially filtered by cognitive anxiety. Again, it's really difficult to measure in any way, shape, or form, and is largely dependent on questionnaires. To really capture this theory, think about the things you have to measure. You have to quantify performance, which we're historically pretty bad at, plus cognitive and somatic anxiety in the moment without ruining that moment, probably through a questionnaire so we don't scare the psychologists. It forces people into a situation where they have to say, I believe this is truth, or I believe this is a good theory, and that's not good enough. That's not science. One interesting factor is the absolute performance level is actually higher with high cognitive anxiety, setting this model apart from the multidimensional theory by identifying that high cognitive anxiety isn't always bad or detrimental to performance. You cannot simply walk back up that cliff, though. The only way to recover performance is to seriously calm down and start again at the bottom left of the curve. Some worry can be useful by narrowing your attention and heightening effort, but if it gets too high, performance deteriorates. But again, it doesn't tell us why or how. It just draws some pretty lines to explain the relationship. There's no causal relationship either. No way to say that if this happens, then this would happen as a result. Whether that should be the end result of this area of science is a discussion for another day. Moving all the way from drive theory to here, this is the stuff of sports psychologists. The notion that we need to match our interventions to the type of anxiety being experienced. Does their head fill up with too many negative thoughts and they can't concentrate? Maybe it's not the best idea to tell them to just breathe and lie down and stay calm, because those thoughts will stay there as they're lying down and breathing. So the solution in that case might be to capture those thoughts and question them and work out whether they're helpful or appropriate, what to do when they're not. Vice versa, for someone who is having physiological or physical symptoms, it may not be vigorously tested, but it's entirely more helpful than just telling an athlete what they're going through. In all of this, we tend to miss out on the properties of the situation, the contextual factors, a person and their personality, or an evaluation of how they feel right now. These are things we can easily measure with questionnaires, again. But if we look at the nature of the task, the difficulty, the consequences of success and failure, time of day can even affect arousal in terms of circadian rhythms. If you had the desire to find a way to measure them all and integrate them into a model, then you'd have a really elegant way of predicting anxiety affects people. But to date, we really don't do that. And it's up to you to question whether you think that's an appropriate way, or whether it's borderline lazy on behalf of our field that we haven't moved past this yet. So we can identify the theories, how they differ, how they consider arousal and anxiety in their own ways, but the only real bridge available to connect this knowledge with actual practice is the matching hypothesis. There's nothing in any of the discussed theories to say this is how you should approach this particular problem. And that's a huge issue, but one we will tackle very soon.